page account, our top stories. The bombardment continues on the ground as the UN Security Council delays a crucial vote on a ceasefire in Syria. A former senior advisor to Donald Trump pleads guilty to conspiracy and lying to FBI investigators. As pressure grows for action on gun ownership, the American president suggests again that classroom teachers should be armed. And taking on the system, the Cuban family prepared to go the extra mile for a long-awaited reunion. Hello. The UN Security Council has postponed a vote on a ceasefire in Syria until later on Saturday. The resolution would have allowed vital aid supplies to reach eastern Ghouta. Opposition activists say hundreds have now died in aerial attacks. Our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, reports.
This is what happened in eastern Ghouta as diplomacy stuttered. The enclave was pounded. 400,000 or so people spent most of the day underground. Above them, Russian jets with their Syrian allies were in action, as the Russians demanded guarantees that rebel fighters would respect any truce. In eastern Ghouta, men from civil defense risked their lives to rescue civilians, even though the buildings could collapse or planes could come back. In the dust and confusion, these children were separated from their parents. The rescuers ignored the dangers. The EU condemned what it called brutal attacks. Diplomacy is supposed to find words and deeds to stop this happening. They were rushed into underground hospitals. It is hard to end a war or even a battle with words, especially when one side, in Syria, the regime and its allies, believes victory is close. In Syria, military power, the capacity to inflict pain and death, sets the pace of events. Treating the wounded is one way for humanity to push back. Another is to recreate small pockets of normality, kindness and decency. Rawa is 11 years old, and like most people in eastern Ghouta, she's been living in a basement. Mothers and their children wait and hope.
It's been 2 months since I went to school and saw my friends. We're here in the shelter because of the bombing. The rockets and missiles never end. I hope the war will stop so we can go home.
Among Syria's children, only teenagers remember peace. The world has failed a generation. These men waited for a lull in the bombing to try to bury a member of their family. They ran out of time. In Syria, no one can rest in peace. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
One of Donald Trump's former campaign aides has admitted charges of conspiracy against the United States and lying to investigators. In a plea deal, Rick Gates has pledged to cooperate in any and all matters with the U.S. Special Counsel's inquiry into alleged Russian political meddling in the U.S. From Los Angeles, Peter Bowes reports.
A day in court for a man under considerable pressure to plead guilty and reveal what he knows about possible Russian meddling in the US election. Facing multiple charges, Rick Gates admitted that he took part in a financial conspiracy with Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's campaign chairman. Mr. Manafort denies the allegations. Mr. Gates also acknowledged lying to the FBI about a meeting in 2013 when the two men sat down with a member of Congress and a lobbyist. He falsely claimed Ukraine, where both men have a long history of working as political consultants, wasn't discussed. There are no allegations that Rick Gates or Paul Manafort colluded with Russia to influence the outcome of the 2016 election. And the president was quick to underline this in a tweet last week, insisting the Trump campaign did nothing wrong, no collusion. But as a leading figure at the centre of the campaign, Mr. Gates could be sitting on information valuable to the special counsel, Robert Mueller. For his part, Mr. Mueller is increasing the pressure on Paul Manafort, bringing additional charges against him. Rick Gates will still go to jail, but the plea deal means his sentence will be much shorter than it could have been. The question is, what will he tell investigators in the meantime? Peter Bowes, BBC News.
President Trump has repeated his call for teachers to be armed with guns. Pressure is growing for action after the shooting at a school in Florida last week, in which 14 students and 3 members of staff were killed. Meanwhile, Florida's governor wants to restrict the sale of guns. Our North America editor, John Sopel, reports.
Staff and teachers returned to the Marjory Stoneman Douglas School today as the nation continues to grope for explanations of what happened. For some, it's all about guns. For others, it's mental health and societal breakdown. But today, a new culprit. Scott Peterson, a deputy sheriff who arrived outside the school 90 seconds after the shooting started, but for whatever reason, didn't act. And he's taking a mighty kicking from the president.
He was there for 5 minutes. For 5 minutes. That was during the entire shooting. He heard it right at the beginning. So he certainly did a poor job. But that's a case where somebody was outside, they're trained, they didn't react properly under pressure, or they were cowards.
Speaking to conservative activists, the president also restated his belief that some teachers should be carrying concealed weapons in school.
And the beauty is it's concealed. Nobody would ever see it unless they needed it. It's concealed. So this crazy man who walked in wouldn't even know who it is that has it. That's good. It's not bad, that's good. And a teacher would have shot the hell out of him before he knew what happened.
And in Florida, the governor has announced a range of measures to tighten security.
The goal of this plan of action is to make massive changes in protecting our schools, provide significantly more resources for mental health, and to do everything we can to keep guns out of the hands of those dealing with mental problems or threatening harms to themselves or others.
The president has just told a news conference we are well on the way to solving that horrible problem of gun violence. But so far there have only been sketchy proposals and no class of weapon is being banned. Well on the way? Well, that might be wishful thinking. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, earlier I spoke to Jim Irvin of the Buckeye Firearms Association in Ohio, where they run a training camp for teachers who are armed and taught to deal with attacks. And I pointed out to him that many people are against arming teachers.
Well, we don't want our kids to keep getting killed.
But looking at all the evidence, say, for example, the FBI has compiled so far, they haven't seen any evidence that arming people in these kinds of situations prevents them from happening or stops the perpetrators from carrying on with what they want to do.
I beg to differ. Imagine if Coach Feist had a firearm. He was there. He went to the event. We've got these people in every school. All we're talking about is the select people. There's no disagreement that the vast majority of our school staff do not want to carry a firearm. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with them, and no one should ever be forced to do this. But if we have people who are going to the scene to die on the event, how about we get them training so that they live through this event? How about they end the killing before one more kid gets shot? I don't understand how that's controversial, giving them the tools to do that.
But what are the practicalities of this? Because the American high schools are very big. Unless you put an armed teacher almost at the door of every classroom or at every single entrance, you're going to just have teachers walking around with guns.
We have that in hundreds of schools, and it works just fine. There is no problem, and there have not been killings at those schools.
So you're saying that the reason that this school in Florida was attacked was because, are you saying that it was not well defended?
No, I don't know why it was attacked, but what we do know when we study active killer events, almost every one in this country happens in the few places where the victims are not allowed to shoot back. There's an absolute trend there. Gun control is a failure. When you look at the results in it, it ends up in more dead people. It is time we realize the unintended consequence of a well-meaning policy, but the bottom line is results matter, and the results of gun control are failure and dead kids. It's enough.
We'd just like to bring you some breaking news from the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul. Officials say a suicide attacker detonated explosives in Shashdarak, which is the diplomatic area of the city. We're hearing that one person so far has been killed and 6 others have been wounded, and the reports say that the attack happened at around 8:30 in the morning local time. That's about, at this point in time, about an hour ago. We'll bring you more details as we get them here on BBC World News. Now let's take a look at some of the other stories making the news. The United States is to extend its stop and search operations on ships suspected of violating sanctions against North Korea. It's the latest US effort to stop Pyongyang's nuclear program. Also, 18 people have died in 2 bomb blasts in the Somali capital, Mogadishu. A suicide bomber blew up a car near the presidential palace. The second blast was close to the National Intelligence Agency. Both were followed by heavy gunfire. The President of the European Council has described as pure illusion any attempt by Britain to pick and choose the terms of its future relationship with Europe. Speaking at a summit of EU leaders, which was not attended by Britain, Donald Tusk said he hoped to get more clarity on exactly what Britain's proposals were when he meets Theresa May next week. From Brussels, Damian Grammaticus reports.
France, Germany, Italy. Europe's leaders all in Brussels today, all waiting to hear what the UK wants from its future ties. But if Theresa May's plan is to seek special access to the single market for parts of the UK economy, it was immediately rebuffed.
It's not an a la carte. It's not possible to be aligned with the European Union when it suits and not when it doesn't. That's not possible.
The EU doesn't yet know what was decided by Mrs May and her ministers at Chequers yesterday, but EU leaders have said before, and they said again today, she can't pick and choose only the bits of the single market she likes.
I am glad that the UK government seems to be moving towards a more detailed position. However, if the media reports are correct, I am afraid that the UK position today is based on pure illusion. It looks like the cake philosophy is still alive.
But the UK's exit poses problems for the EU too. Today its leaders were tackling perhaps the thorniest issue of all, the EU's looming budget problem. When UK payments to the EU cease, the EU will face a shortfall of more than €10 billion a year. That's at least 10% of its annual spending.
There's a hole in the budget, so is you prepared to accept less and see cuts to spending?
Well, you know, if you listen to politicians, there's usually a hole in the budget, but finally things are financed. So if we want to finance more, we have to pay more. It's very simple.
Is your country prepared to pay more after Brexit?
No. If I should keep my answer short, I would say no.
So hints at divisions between EU countries, and that might just give the UK some leverage in the negotiations to come. Damian Grammaticus, BBC News, Brussels.
Stay with us on BBC News. Still to come, Made in North Korea, a graphic design exhibition opens in London which offers outsiders a window into the secretive state. This is BBC News. The latest headlines. As Syrian airstrikes continue to bombard eastern Ghouta, the UN Security Council has again postponed a crucial vote on a humanitarian ceasefire. A former senior advisor to President Trump has pleaded guilty to conspiracy and lying to FBI investigators who are examining Russian influence in the 2016 presidential election. Now let's get more on our top story, the ongoing crisis in Syria and the UN's decision to postpone a vote on a potential ceasefire. Well, earlier I spoke to Lina Sergi, who is a Syrian-American writer from Aleppo who now lives in Chicago. She gave us her view on the political and humanitarian situation.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this very tragic week for Syria, where we've seen the war escalate even further, this very long war. It's become the norm for these kinds of situations where the regime and Russia are bombarding Syrian civilian neighborhoods and areas like Eastern Ghouta, like we saw last year in Aleppo. And when it comes down to the Security Council bringing in a resolution that would actually stop all of the violence across the country for 30 days to give civilians the relief that they deserve to be able to live without the bombs, Russia delays the vote and will probably veto it.
But I thought that was the whole point of diplomats. They are supposed to be able to bridge the gaps where they exist.
Well, when it comes to Syria, what we've seen over the past 7 years, so many resolutions that were aimed towards protection of civilians against airstrikes, against chemical weapons attacks, against the sieges that use starvation as a weapon of war, and all of the war crimes that are being used against the Syrian people for over almost 7 years, with hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of refugees, millions of displaced, over 5 million people in need of humanitarian assistance inside the country, and still these resolutions get vetoed by Russia.
So it would seem that this is, at best, if it can be gotten through, would be just a sticking plaster.
True, but it will be also saving lives, as many lives as we can save, at least opening up humanitarian corridors to reach the people of Eastern Ghouta who, even before this latest bombardment and escalation of violence and attacks by the regime and Russian air forces, had been suffering from malnutrition, from lack of any kind of basic necessities. Humanitarian agencies need to reach the people of Eastern Ghouta, over 400,000 people living in this siege, and they must be, people must be able to reach them and help as many people as possible to survive.
I mean, how can people help? How can the people of Ghouta be assisted at this point in time?
First of all, we need to have a no-fly zone or a just complete stop of the airstrikes on Eastern Ghouta. There has to be a cessation of the hostilities first. And then we need to open up humanitarian access corridors for the agencies to be able to enter Eastern Ghouta, evacuate the people in need of medical assistance, and reach the children and the elderly who are suffering from extreme malnutrition.
Barbara Alston, lead singer of the 60s US girl group The Crystals, has died at the age of 74. She was crucial to the sound of hit singles such as Da Do Run Run and There's No Other Like My Baby. She died a week ago in North Carolina after contracting the flu, but the news has only now emerged. Tributes are also being paid to Eddie Amour of the band The Real Thing, who has also died aged 74. Famous for hits such as You to Me Are Everything in the 1970s, the band were considered pioneers in the UK music industry after becoming the first all-black band to reach #1. When America announced last September that its embassy in Havana would no longer be issuing visas, it marked a serious cooling of relations with Cuba. It also meant that Cubans would have to travel to the embassy in Colombia instead. Andrew Plant reports.
A hotel room in Colombia, Rebelo Lego is already a long way from home. He's come from Cuba, bags packed with paperwork, to try to get a visa to enter the USA and visit the family he hasn't seen for almost 6 years.
Con tremenda alegría, viviendo ya un momento de un cambio trascendental en mi vida.
I'm really looking forward to this life-changing moment. All the effort will be worth it. To be with my family, that is my one and only wish.
La mejor convicción, la mejor vida es estar con la familia, la que uno crea.
Cubans used to get US visas through an embassy in Havana. Now, though, they must travel 2,000 kilometers to Bogota in Colombia. Last year, President Trump announced the US was suspending visa processing in Havana, partially reversing policies put in place by his predecessor Barack Obama. The number of immigrant visas issued to Cubans has since crashed. The extra travel cost simply too much for many. Pedro, a pastry salesman, is one of the lucky ones, finally getting the paperwork he needs.
Today
I have got what I most desired, to reunite with my family and share time with them in the United States, to see my children, my grandchildren, all my family.
Now united after so many years with his daughter, overcoming the extra difficulties that are now stopping so many Cubans from setting foot on American soil. Andrew Plant, BBC News.
In the wake of the school shooting in Florida, students across the United States have been calling for stricter gun laws. But what do young activists at the Conservative Political Action Conference in Maryland think about the issue? We went to find out.
People do tend to talk about young people as a group and say, you know, all young people believe a certain way.
I actually really do admire a lot of the students who are out there and organizing.
I'm hopeful that America is turning a corner and our generation isn't going to fail in the same way that past younger generations have.
So I think it's really encouraging to see such an aware generation that's so capable of using their means when it comes to social media, email, communicating with national organizations. So I don't agree with them, but I think it's awesome that they're able to do what they do.
I do understand the anger and the hostility that's happening among my generation, because it is my generation that's being affected by this. This kind of incident hasn't happened in any other generation in the history of our nation. So I applaud anyone who's out there spreading their voice and making their voices heard and being involved. I may not have the same solution, but I'm not going to stop someone from being out there and saying what they want to say.
What happened is a tragedy and you can't escape that. It's heartless and terrible. But I don't believe that allowing that anger to shape our policy is a prudent idea in any way. And on top of that, I completely disagree with what they're actually proposing. I think that a lot of people disagree with what they're proposing.
No one wants to have to think about their children having teachers who are armed in their classroom. That's a scary thought, but unfortunately I think it's come to the point where more dramatic measures have to be taken.
Obtaining guns legally is a part of American culture, so we have to come to understand how we can best use background checks.
And I think that if we can repair the sense of community, if we can repair faith and all these other things, family, then we're going to see the gun issue completely disappear.
You want to take our guns away, and then the other side saying, no, we just want to put guns in every teacher's pocket. It's well, that's not constructive. I'm hopeful that our generation can look at it in a more constructive way, but it has to be facilitated by the adults and the people with actual, political power to wield.
As we've been hearing, the United States has unveiled a raft of new sanctions aimed at North Korea, a country we know so little about. But a new exhibition in London opening in London is aiming to change that, as the BBC's Tim Allman explains.
When you think of North Korea, these are the sort of images that probably come to mind. Military parades, precision marching, a closed-off, isolated country, and mystery to the rest of the world. That's why this exhibition is such an eye-opener. It's trying to provide some insight into what life is really like for the North Koreans.
We don't understand North Korea. It's a very complicated country. We understand elements of it, but we tend to have a very black and white viewpoint. So I think this is one of these elements that is to start to understand, to improve our knowledge gap.
There are propaganda posters, packaging for sweets and soft drinks, even packets of North Korean sugar. It's not all inward looking. Here, a collection of stamps featuring Princess Diana, made to commemorate the birth of Prince William.
I'd be very worried if someone saw this exhibition and decided then to defect to North Korea. That would make me worry, but I think it's much more likely that someone is going to see something and understand a little bit more and want to understand more, because it's this lack of knowledge in the world, particularly today, that creates worry.
For so many people, North Korea has become an enigma. Its people unknowable, its future uncertain. This exhibition, which runs until May, could change that just a little. Tim Allman, BBC News.
And just a reminder that you can get in touch with me and the rest of the team. I am at Nkem Ikejika. Bye-bye.